So, Andrew, first to you. Do you agree with the DOJ move to wind down those federal legal cases against Donald Trump rather than have Jack Smith try to sprint to the finish before January 20th?
Well, there's a DOJ policy written by two separate offices of legal counsel that you cannot charge and prosecute a sitting president. It's a policy. And as a practical matter, Andrea, there's no way for Jack Smith to sprint to the finish before January 20th. In the D.C. case, there's not even a trial date set, and the issues there are ones that are likely to have to go back to the Supreme Court. And in the Florida case, that is a case that's actually dismissed by the district court, and that is pending appeal. So there is no way for him to get to a trial, and the American public thus have not had the benefit of a trial and a jury making a determination as to the president-elect's guilt. And so it's very understandable that the Department of Justice would be thinking about how to have these cases essentially dismissed without prejudice, or to put on a pause given that DOJ policy.
Andrew, I have to ask you, because you've written so much about this and thought so much about these cases, the classified documents case, all the cases, January 6th. How do you feel as a former prosecutor and a lawyer?
I think of this very much from an international perspective. So, Andrea, very much in your wheelhouse, because I think about the other countries that have been able to have a legal system that have held political leaders, even the most senior political leaders, to account in fair trials. And that is not to prejudge what a jury would do here, but the defendant and the public had a right to have a speedy trial. And I think our legal system has really failed us, at least at the federal level. The New York criminal case is one that has gone to a verdict. And so the public has had the benefit, Donald Trump and the prosecution have had the benefit of the trial. But in general, I think that our country does not look like the sort of vaunted rule of law country that we like to think it is.
So, Lisa, what does this mean for the sentencing, which is scheduled for less than 3 weeks from now? And what about the civil cases where he owes money?
Well, let's start, Chris, with the sentencing, because the sentencing is not necessarily a foregone conclusion. Donald Trump has a pending motion to set aside the jury's verdict in the Manhattan DA's criminal case on the grounds that the Supreme Court's immunity decision in July precluded the use of certain evidence that the trial judge, Juan Merchan, allowed into the case. He's scheduled to decide that motion on November 12th. If he agrees that the case should stand, and I should say prosecutors submitted something saying, you know, whatever you decide, judge, is kind of fine with us on this one. But if that stands, then we would proceed to sentencing on the 26th. As I sit here today, there is no case that I could cite to you that precludes the sentencing of a president-elect. But then again, when I sat here several months ago, there was no case that could have helped me predict that the Supreme Court would say that a president who is criminally prosecuted is immune for acts within his official duties, or those that are part of his core constitutional powers at the very least. So I think it's anybody's game, and we should expect some legal filings from the Trump team with respect to that New York case. With respect to the civil cases, though, I want to be really clear with you and our viewers that the pardon power never impacts civil liabilities, and the president, as you know, has multiple outstanding civil liabilities that are on appeal, including to the New York Attorney General, to whom he now owes $450 million and counting, and to E. Jean Carroll, who won 2 separate trials against him, one on sexual abuse claims and defamation, the second on defamation alone. He owes her currently more than $90 million, and both of those cases are on appeal, Chris.
Andrew, Donald Trump has promised to pardon January 6 convicts, including potentially some of the more violent ones. Is there any precedent for this?
Well, the pardon power is in the Constitution, and I think that we can all go back in history, and frankly not too far back in history, to look at abuses of the pardon power that a president holds. What is different here is the connection of the pardon power to a personal interest that the president has. And so that is something that I won't say it's unprecedented, but it's certainly unusual. There, however, is nothing at all illegal about it. That is something that the president would be able to do. Obviously, the idea that somebody would be pardoned who engaged in violent conduct is something that I'm not aware of. Usually they're for crimes that have to do with low-level drug offenses or sometimes public corruption type cases, or somebody who served a long term in jail well beyond what would be the norm at the time. And so it seems like a disproportionate punishment. Here, the idea that a pardon would apply to people who engaged in the violent attack at the Capitol seems like certainly a questionable use of the pardon power.